For 6 years, the world burned in a storm of steel and fire. From the sky, from the sea, and from the land, millions of men marched convinced they were serving a cause that would soon devour them. This is not the story of the victors, nor of the speeches. It is the story of those who fought until the end, believing that surviving was still a way of fighting. This is how the war was lived, from the German side, the noise of the beginning. The first day smelled of metal and cut grass. No one spoke much. On the trains going east, the men played cards, cleaned their rifles, looked out the window. The officers said it would be quick. Poland would not last. Most believed it. Some had the word Blitzkrieg in their mouths as if it were a promise. Crossing the border, the sky filled with Stukas. The sound was so sharp it seemed to break the air. The columns advanced through small towns, with signs written in a language no one understood. The tanks crushed fences, the infantry ran behind. A soldier wrote, "The ground trembles and does not stop." It was not fear, not yet. It was the certainty of being inside something great. In the villages, dogs barked at the convoys. The peasants watched without moving. Some raised their hands, others closed their doors. The Germans kept walking, eating hard bread, smoking cigarettes. No one knew where the front was. Each day they advanced more, without understanding what was left behind. In Warsaw, the sky turned black. The bombs fell and the dust entered the lungs. From the air, the pilots saw the entire city burn like a giant bonfire. On the ground, the soldiers heard the screams mixed with the roar of the engines. Modern war had rhythm, not pause. Meanwhile, in Germany, the newspapers spoke of victory. The radios broadcast military marches. In Berlin, people filled the squares to listen to the announcements. The mothers applauded with wet eyes. The bakeries remained open. The men too old to serve shook hands with those departing. No one thought of casualties. There were no absences yet, only names written in the newspapers in large letters. In the northern ports, the Navy prepared for its war. The crews of the first U-boats said their farewells in silence. The decks shone with the smell of diesel and salt. The Atlantic seemed clean, infinite. The captain gave the order, and the submarine disappeared beneath the water. Inside, the air was thick, the clocks fogged, the men breathed slowly. Werner would later remember that the sea was beautiful until it turned dark. In the first sinking, one of the torpedoes failed, and everyone felt the blow as a warning. No one said it aloud. Along the roads, the advance became mechanical. The dust got into the food, into the clothes, into the teeth. The portable radios repeated news of success without interruption. After a few days, there was no visible enemy left. The soldiers stopped in empty towns, slept in barns, wrote letters. Some kept watches or photographs found in houses. Others burned what they did not want to see. The pilots counted flight hours like candies. Some returned with red eyes from the smoke, others did not return. No one asked. In the camps, the songs kept playing, but with less strength. A corporal wrote in his diary, "They promised us movement." Now there is only noise. When Warsaw fell, the front stopped for the first time. The tanks lined up on the roads like sleeping animals. The men sat on the hulls and smoked without talking. Some believed the war was over. Others, those who had seen too quickly the road to success, understood it was only the beginning. In Germany, the lights remained on. Families waited for the letters that arrived with new stamps. The streets were calm. The factories worked without rest, the workshops full of women replacing the men who were already far away. They spoke of an invincible nation. The lines at the cinemas were long. In the newsreels, the map of the East filled with black arrows that seemed to advance without end. The sea was witness to the invisible enemy that had begun to answer. The British destroyers hunted in the dark. In the submarines, the sound of foreign propellers made the bodies tremble. Each dive was a game of patience. They slept sitting, ate in silence, wrote in the dark. A sailor wrote on a damp piece of paper, "Below there is no sky, only time." The army awaited new orders. The trains returned loaded with captured material. The generals spoke of reorganization. No one mentioned the dead. In their letters, the soldiers wrote about food, about rain, about cigarettes. The officers knew the next destination would be the West. Some wanted to go home before leaving again. They did not. Cities like Berlin and Munich saw civilians who were beginning to hear the first rumors about a naval blockade, about the rationing to come. There was still confidence, but the air was different. In the cafes, conversations grew shorter. People spoke more softly. In the cinemas, the applause was weaker. There were victories, yes, but also a fatigue that no one yet recognized. In the ports, the submarines returned slowly, covered in salt and smoke. Some docked at night, without music or speeches. The men disembarked pale, exhausted, and walked to the barracks. Sometimes families waited for them, other times no one. On the decks remained the marks of water and empty shells. A captain wrote in his logbook, "The silence of the return weighs more than the sea." In the barracks, the soldiers cleaned the mud from their boots and listened to the radio. The Führer's voice sounded clear, promising a new campaign. He said that France would fall in weeks. The men applauded. Some believed him. Others thought of the coming winter. The war, which at first seemed like a race, was beginning to turn into a habit. And meanwhile, at home, the mothers looked at the portraits of their sons in uniform. The streets were calm, the trams kept passing. No one knew that the worst had not yet begun. The perfect advance. The orders arrived before dawn. No one knew exactly when it would begin, but everyone was ready. The tanks waited with engines running, covered in dew. In the wagons, the soldiers yawned with their rifles between their legs. Some spoke of Paris without having yet seen the border. The air smelled of exhaust smoke and old coffee. When the signal was given, the columns moved as one body. The ground vibrated. The crossing to the west was faster than expected. In the French villages, the windows closed as the troops passed. There were torn posters, thrown bicycles, cars abandoned at the sides of the roads. In the squares, the children watched in silence. The army advanced without stopping. On the maps, the arrows seemed to pierce everything. The officers spoke little. The non-commissioned officers repeated what was essential. Keep going. In the north, the roads toward Belgium were congested. The columns of refugees mixed with the German convoys. Some soldiers threw bread to the children. Others pushed the civilians aside with the barrel of their rifles. No one had time for anything. In the air, the Stukas appeared and disappeared like insects. The explosions raised white smoke that spread across the fields. The pace was so fast that many did not remember having slept in days. An officer wrote in his notebook, "We move as if fatigue did not exist." The Navy observed the same advance from afar. On the docks of Wilhelmshaven, the men followed the progress of the campaign by radio. The U-boats kept leaving on patrols toward the North Atlantic, ever farther, ever less secure. On the decks, the sailors counted the days without seeing sunlight. On the surface, the British destroyers hunted without rest. The depth charges made the steel walls tremble. Werner would remember that the sound was like thunder inside the chest. In the silence that followed, no one breathed. In Norway, the landings were chaotic. The snow, the fjords, the darkness. The Germans faced for the first time an enemy who knew the terrain, and the sea turned into a trap. The sinking of the Blücher resounded like a dry blow to naval morale. On the surviving ships, the decks were covered with frozen blood and pieces of cable. The sailors who returned to Germany did not speak much. In the reports it was written, strategic success, but the crews knew that the North had cost them more than admitted. France, the Republic of Napoleon, watched the army that continued its march. On the hills, the panzers passed between houses still intact. The peasants came out after the noise, collecting what was left. The German soldiers found served dishes, radios still on, clocks that kept marking the hour. Some took a family photo and kept it in their pocket. Others slept on the seats of trucks with their rifles resting on their chests. In Dunkirk, the air was grey, full of smoke and screams. From the coast, the men saw the enemy ships crowded together. They fired without looking. The sea burned with a colour no one had seen before. The pilots returned with blackened faces. The oxygen masks smelled of rubber and fear. In the hangars, the mechanics cleaned the shrapnel from the wings. The victory reports mixed with the casualty lists. Each name erased from the board was one more silence in the canteen. Modern war was speed, and speed left no room to think. In Germany, the population followed the advance through the newsreels. The cinemas were full. The images showed ordered columns, flags, prisoners. No one saw the mud or the smell. In the streets, the children played at marching. The women worked in the factories and in the post offices. The letters arrived with new stamps, with short and firm phrases. All well. We advance fast. The lines in the shops grew, but there was still bread. Portraits and flags hung from the balconies. The nights were quiet. On the surface ships, the officers listened to the same news as the civilians, but they knew that the sea had become an enemy. The Bismarck prepared for its first departure. The men checked every valve, every turret. In the captain's cabin, the noise of the machines was constant. The steel shone as if nothing could harm it. When the ship set sail, the harbour sirens sounded for the last time. No one on deck imagined it would be the only one. The Western Front had the German army on the shores of the Channel. The troops were exhausted, the vehicles damaged, but the euphoria remained. The units advanced along roads covered with dust and ruins. Paris fell without resistance. The soldiers crossed the boulevards on motorcycles and trucks. Some got down to look at the shop windows, others simply continued following the convoy. A soldier wrote in his notebook, "Everything seems too easy." In Berlin, the bells rang for victory. The newspapers sold out in minutes. The radios repeated speeches and figures. There was talk of the new order, of a Europe under control. In the cafes, the wine was expensive, but no one complained. The families of the dead received laconic telegrams. "Your son fell fulfilling his duty." The phrase became common. Those who still had sons at the front read it as a threat. On the docks, the sailors listened to the news about France while preparing the return convoys. In the Atlantic, the Allied ships kept sinking, but each departure cost more. The crews aged quickly. They slept little, laughed less. In the narrow corridors, the air was so heavy that the lamps went out on their own. Those who returned to port had grey skin. Some did not speak for days. The army camps were quiet, with the men cleaning their weapons, counting ammunition, waiting for new orders. They knew there would be no rest. The East was already a constant rumour in conversations. In the bars, the officers said that England would fall soon. In the shelters, the families heard the sirens for the first time. The windows shook. The shadows of the planes passed over the roofs. The children woke up without crying. No one calmed them. In the northern seas, the Bismarck sailed toward its fate. The sailors felt it alive beneath their feet. When the first enemy shells hit it, the deck filled with fire and smoke. The steel bent as if it breathed. The men ran to the turrets without looking back. The water came in quickly. In the control room, someone shouted that the rudder was jammed. The captain ordered to resist. The sea responded with silence. On land, the soldiers celebrated the fall of France. The civilians hung flags. The radios spoke of a future that seemed assured. In the newspapers, the map of Europe was almost entirely grey. No one knew that what followed would be the beginning of the loss. The Infinite Front, the Russian campaign. In the airfields of northern France, the men awoke to the noise of compressors. The mechanics worked since before dawn, lining up the Messerschmitt Bf 109 next to the Heinkel bombers. The smell of fuel and oil filled the air. The pilots walked among the shadows with their helmets in hand, smoking in silence. Some were veterans of Spain, like Galland or Molders. Others had barely left flight school. On the walls of the barracks, the casualty reports hung as reminders of chance. On the 13th of August of 1940, the Adlertag, the Day of the Eagle, the morning was cloudy over the Channel. Goering had promised that in 4 days the RAF would cease to exist. The squadrons took off from Calais, Lille and Cherbourg. On the radios, the voices were dry, without emotion. At 10 o'clock, the sky over Southampton and Portland was full of black dots. A pilot later wrote that there was more fire than clouds. The Spitfires rose from the coast as if emerging from the sea. In seconds, the air became a web of crossing paths. In Helmut Wick's Bf 109, the fuel gauge marked half when he sighted his 10th target of the day. He accelerated, fired, banked, and lost it again in the smoke. Years later, the survivors would remember that the sky seemed to vibrate. The Hispano cannons of the British fighters pierced the fuselages of the Heinkels. The German gunners responded from the turrets. Many planes caught fire before anyone could open the hatch. Some pilots jumped with parachutes. Others chose to crash with the engine in flames. On the ground, the controllers watched the radars in the channel stations. The dots disappeared one after another. In the hangars, the mechanics waited with cigarettes hanging from their mouths. When a plane managed to land, they received it in silence. The noise of the engines died, and only the smell of hot metal remained. In the squadron logs, the losses were noted without adjectives. KIA, missing wounded. In the first days, the figures seemed favourable. In Berlin, the reports spoke of complete success. Goebbels wrote in his diary, "Our aviators dominate the air." England is defenseless, but the telegrams from Luftwaffe 2 were colder. Losses, 45 aircraft. RAF still active. Each flight cost more, the British learned. In August, they began to intercept the formations before they reached the targets. The German fighters had to escort the bombers to London and return with just enough fuel to cross the Channel. When a plane fell into the sea, the crews watched it sink, unable to help. The survivors floated among debris, waiting for rescue ships that often never came. A sergeant recounted that the first time he saw a friendly plane burning over the water, he thought the fire was still part of the sky. The pressure on the pilots was unbearable. On rest days, they slept with their helmets still on. Galland, after his 20th combat, asked for a cigarette upon landing. When they offered it, he lit it backwards. No one laughed. In a photograph taken in Saint-Omer, he is seen looking at the horizon with his jacket open, his eyes sunken. "I only wanted a bit of peace," he would say years later, even if just for 5 minutes. German civilians followed the news on the radio. In the houses, they spoke of the heroes of the air. The children played with wooden airplanes. In Berlin, victories were celebrated with improvised concerts. But at the end of August, the first British bombs fell on the capital. They were not many, but the impact was psychological. Goebbels wrote, "The war has come home." In the shelters, families went down with blankets and thermoses. The youngest counted the seconds between the siren and the explosion. The elders said it was impossible for London to resist so long. At sea, the U-boats continued their own war. While the Luftwaffe fought in the sky, the submarines intercepted convoys south of Iceland. Werner described one night when they listened on the radio to Goering's speech while loading torpedoes in the dark. "He promised we would conquer the sky," he recalled, "but we only saw water." Each time a torpedo hit a British freighter, the captain ordered immediate dive. Sometimes they felt the explosions, sometimes only silence. In the narrow corridors, the men slept beside the valves, the air thick with diesel and fear. At the beginning of September, Hitler ordered a change of tactics. The RAF resisted better than expected. The civilian morale had to be broken. The bombers began to attack London. The columns of fire were visible from the North Sea. The German aviators said they could orient themselves by the flames. They flew over the city at 1,000 meters, dropping bombs amid a glow that seemed infinite. From below, the Londoners heard the roar of the engines mixed with the sound of the sirens. In the underground shelters, a woman wrote in her diary, "The ground vibrates as if it were breathing." But German losses increased. In a single week of September, more than 350 aircraft were lost. The veteran pilots began to fall. On the 28th of that month, Molders was shot down and wounded. Wick would disappear in November over the Channel. Goering, furious, blamed the intermediate commanders. In the airfields, the orders changed every day. The crews knew that the promised victory was fading away. The telegrams reached home with the same phrase, "Ihr Sohn ist für Führer und Vaterland gefallen." Your son has fallen for the Führer and the fatherland. The mothers folded the paper carefully and kept it in drawers. In the factories, the women worked double shifts to repair planes. The optimism of the summer turned into resignation. In the last flights of October, the German pilots noticed something different. The British fighters were waiting. They no longer chased them from behind. They intercepted them head-on, as if they knew exactly where they would come from. It was the radar. The German squadrons returned with half of their men. The aerial photographs showed London in ruins, but England still stood. One night, Galland was summoned by Goering. The Marshal asked him what he needed to win the war. Galland answered without hesitation, "A squadron of Spitfires." No one mentioned it again. In Berlin, winter came with blackouts. The sirens sounded more and more often. The children slept dressed, the mothers cooked with flashlights. The windows were sealed with paper tape. In the streets, the neighbors greeted one another without speaking. The sky, that space where victory had been promised, had become the enemy. In the French hangars, the mechanics dismantled engines with frozen hands. The damaged planes served as spare parts for others. The new pilots barely had flight hours. The veterans no longer wrote letters. Some spoke of the East, of a new campaign being prepared. Others simply remained silent. In November, the Luftwaffe received the order to suspend daytime attacks. Officially, it was a winter pause. In reality, it was the silent acknowledgement that the British sky could not be conquered. The reports said, strategic withdrawal. The men knew it was another word for failure. In the Atlantic, the sailors still heard the echoes of the battle on the ship radios. In Germany, the civilians went out into the streets with their hands in their pockets, looking up every time they heard a plane. The sound was no longer a promise of victory, but a warning. The War of the Wolves in the Atlantic. The smell of diesel stuck to the clothes before boarding. On the docks of Kiel, the mothers embraced the sailors without looking at the water. The shipyard sirens sounded like a mechanical farewell. The men went down through the hatch one after another until they disappeared. Inside the U-boat, the air was thick, humid, with a metallic taste. Werner, a young watch officer, would remember that the silence of the port lasted barely a minute. Afterward, everything was vibration. When the submarine submerged, the sound of the world was cut off. Only the hum of the electric motor and the constant dripping of the valves remained. The men spoke in whispers. The captain walked barefoot so as not to make noise. Sometimes days went by without seeing the light. Meals were reduced to damp bread and bitter coffee. They slept in shifts in the same bunks, also taking turns with the blankets. Moisture covered the uniforms and the skin smelled of mold. Each breath seemed borrowed. On the surface, the Atlantic was another enemy. The waves struck the conning tower and the men clung to the metal to avoid being thrown off. On clear nights, the horizon looked like an endless line of fire. The Allied convoys were detected by radar and the captain ordered an attack. In the corridors, the sailors moved with learned precision. The valves were closed, the torpedoes loaded, the engines shut down. The voice of the control officer was heard like an echo. Ziel erfasst, los. Target fixed, fire. The impact was felt like a blow to the stomach. Then came the silence, and afterward the sound of the enemy's steel breaking apart. In the hydrophone, the explosion was muffled. Some men closed their eyes. In the logbook, only one figure was recorded. One ship sunk. No one wrote down the screams that were heard under the water. When the enemy launched depth charges, the hull vibrated down to the teeth. The lights flickered. The air became heavier. Water oozed through the welds. The men counted the seconds between one explosion and the next. Werner wrote, "It was as if the sea breathed above us, waiting to crush us." When the pressure eased, the silence felt like a blessing. The families waited for the High Command's lists. In Hamburg and Wilhelmshaven, the women approached the naval offices every Thursday. Some stood looking at the sea until dusk without speaking. The children played with pieces of wood that imitated ships. In the bakeries, people spoke in low voices. The radio report said, "Our grey wolves triumph in the Atlantic," but each month, fewer crews returned. In May of 1941, the pride of the Kriegsmarine set sail, the Bismarck. Von Mullenheim-Rechberg would remember that the deck shone like new silver. The sailors believed in the invincibility of the ship. When the hood exploded off Iceland, the news swept through Germany like a wave. But 3 days later, the British found the giant. Under a grey sky, the turrets of the Bismarck returned fire until the last shell. When the bridge was destroyed and the decks were burning, the captain ordered, "Abandon ship." Only 115 men survived. In the ports, no one mentioned the defeat. In the newspapers, the word glory took the place of loss. At the bottom of the Atlantic, the submarines kept hunting. Life inside the steel had become a routine of fear. Some men spoke to the boat as if it were a living being. Werner wrote that the sound of the hull under pressure was the sigh of a sleeping beast. Others clung to superstitions, a coin under the hatch, a photo stuck above the sonar. When a sailor died, they wrapped him in canvas and threw him into the sea in silence. No one prayed. The bases of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire filled with damaged submarines. The concrete walls vibrated with each departure. The prostitutes, the black markets, and the smell of rum replaced the hymns. The captains wrote ever shorter reports. Success was measured in weeks of survival. In 1943, mortality exceeded 70%. The patrols were missions of no return. In the air, the Allied patrol planes tracked every wave. The German civilians barely understood that war. In the newsreels, torpedoes were shown in slow motion, Wagner's music and waving flags. But the names of the submarines disappeared from the reports. In Hamburg, the bombings left the port in ruins. The widows of sailors worked in the steel factories, welding pieces for new ships. On the walls, yellowed portraits hung. Some lit candles before the map of the Atlantic. In the final years, the sea became a tomb. The return routes were watched. The depth charges fell without warning. The radars detected even the size. Werner described the last patrol as a weight inside a tomb that still floats. When the submarine surfaced for surrender, the air smelled of rust and diesel like the first day. But the sea no longer answered. On land, the few who returned walked with their eyes fixed on the ground. No one asked them what they had seen. The ships had no graves, and the names of the fallen were written on marble without dates. On the docks, the wind blew among the rusted hulls. The survivors said that the sea had never freed them. General Winter. The dawn of the 22nd of June of 1941 arrived with the smell of gasoline and earth. On the eastern border, the men rose without anyone giving the order. The machines roared in formation under a mist that would not lift. The tank crews of Panzer Group 3 polished their periscopes with wool rags. No one spoke. At 3:15, the cannons opened fire. In seconds, the horizon ignited. The soldiers said that the earth trembled as if the world were splitting apart. Hoth wrote that the advance looked like a river of steel, 1,700 tanks crossing the swamps, the Luftwaffe clearing the way with diving Stukas. The infantry marched through the dust, covered in sweat and mosquitoes. In the first villages, the Russian peasants fled without looking back. An officer noted that the smell of burnt grain mixed with that of flesh. The orders were simple: advance, encircle, destroy. In 1 week, Minsk fell. The men were convinced it was another France. Sager remembered that they sang in the trucks, that the soldiers shaved and wrote letters, but the enthusiasm rotted quickly. The dust of the road entered the food and the lungs. The Russians did not surrender. An artilleryman wrote, "They are not men, they are shadows that return." In Smolensk, the heat was so dense that the grenades cooked in the sun. The tanks ran out of gasoline and the corpses ran out of names. The Luftwaffe pilots saw from the air the endless line of the front. They said that the sky of Russia was different, higher, emptier. On every flight they found columns of smoke that they did not know whether they came from the enemy or from their own infantry. Many planes were lost by simple disorientation. A veteran pilot said that sometimes they flew for hours without seeing a road, only the flashes of distant fires. The mechanics on the improvised airfields used vegetable oil when the lubricant ran out. On the radio, a phrase was repeated, "The front is too large for a map." The civilians in Germany received the news as a triumph. The newspapers showed maps with arrows reaching Moscow. In Berlin, people bought postcards of the Kremlin with German flags superimposed. The mothers sent packages of tobacco and chocolate to the regiments, but the first trains of wounded began to arrive in August. The hospitals filled with men without legs, without eyes, with grey skin from burns. The nurses said that the smell of those trains never went away. At sea, the war continued in silence. The U-boats intercepted Soviet convoys in the Baltic, and the crews said the enemy ships did not sink, they came apart. In the northern ice, the German destroyers escorted transports to Finland. A sailor wrote, "The sea is so still it frightens. Here there is no noise, only cold on the docks. The families no longer asked when they would return. They asked if they would still exist." At the front, the soldiers slept on the hard ground. The uniforms were covered in dust, and the mosquitoes entered through the cracks in the helmet. In the rivers, the bodies floated next to the horses. Balk remembered that the officers no longer spoke of victories, but of roots and gasoline. In the villages, the Russian children watched the tanks pass with empty eyes. A corporal of the Leibstandarte wrote, "Each house we burn leaves us 1 year older." The advance continued toward Smolensk, then toward Vyazma. The sensation was of endless movement. Sager said that one day he realized he no longer knew in what country he was. The maps were useless. The roads were mud. The Wehrmacht had entered a space where distances were another form of defeat. Through radio and cinema, propaganda repeated that winter would not stop victory. Goebbels promised that Moscow would fall before Christmas. But the letters from the front brought another voice. The men asked for gloves, boots, soap. Some wrote only to say, "Still alive." In the shelters of Berlin, families listened to those words as if they were prayers. In the airfields, the mechanics used hot water to defrost the machine guns. The pilots covered their faces with frozen scarves. From the air, the forests were black stains on the snow. The Russian planes appeared suddenly, fired and disappeared. No one spoke of heroism, they spoke of physical endurance. The army stretched so far that the convoys got lost. The trucks were trapped in the mud up to the axles. In the villages, the men slept in barns with the horses. The Russian peasants stole the corpses to take their boots. One night, a detachment of engineers was found frozen beside a river. Their eyes were open, as if still watching. The U-boats in the north received the order to support the operations against the Arctic convoys. The sea was covered with ice. The men worked with bleeding hands. In the logbook of a submarine it read, "Torpedo failed. Temperature, -20 degrees. Ice in the valve. Cannot close." When December came, the first officers admitted that Moscow would not fall. On the command maps, the arrows stopped. The soldiers kept marching without knowing why. Saja remembered that the ground cracked under the frozen bodies, that the horses broke apart when they fell. The war had become something without shape. In Germany, the bombings over the cities increased. People went down to the shelters and spoke softly of the war in the East, as if it were a myth. Those who had sent sons to the front received telegrams without explanations. In the cinemas, the propaganda films continued to be shown. The applause sounded weak. In the ports, the wind brought the smell of coal and salt. The sailors looked at the horizon as if it were another front. The winter of 1941 ended with a word no one wanted to pronounce: stagnation. The spring of Stalingrad. The summer of 1942 began with dust. The men said that the sun did not rise but fell. The air was full of flies and the smell of gasoline. The convoys advanced south between columns of smoke. No one knew the names of the villages they crossed. On the maps, the Volga was only a blue line, but in reality it seemed endless. The order was simple: reach Stalingrad and take it. The infantry soldiers marched through dry fields. The wheels of the cannons left grooves in the hard ground. Saja wrote that the heat made the watches stop. The bodies of the horses swelled at the sides of the road. The men drank murky water from puddles. In the empty villages they found broken toys, spoons, photos of families that no longer existed. A corporal of the 24th Panzer said, "The enemy is not in front, he is everywhere." When the Luftwaffe began to bomb Stalingrad, the sky turned orange. From above, the pilots saw the city burn like a map of embers. The heat waves distorted the horizon. In the reports, they spoke of total success. But on the ground, the city still stood, made of dust and rubble. The soldiers who crossed the Volga under fire said that the water smelled of hot metal. Every meter cost a life. Koshorek, gunner of the 24th Division, remembered that the combats were at less than 10 meters. The grenades rolled down the hallways and the men fired through holes in the walls. Sometimes the bodies fell so close that their hands remained intertwined. The Russians did not retreat. The Germans did not either. Stalingrad had no front, he wrote later, only rooms taken or lost. In the underground shelters, the officers ate hard bread with brick dust. The wounded asked for water and received morphine. The stretcher-bearers stopped counting them. In the reports of the Sixth Army, they spoke of a stable situation, but the encirclement was already closed. The transport pilots who tried to drop supplies over the pocket said that the smoke rose up to 4,000 meters. Many planes were hit before releasing the cargo. At sea, the men of the Kriegsmarine listened to the news by radio in the ports of the Baltic. The voices were slower and slower. Stalingrad resists. The sailors knew that that word meant something else: isolation. In the Atlantic, the submarines received the order to maintain radio silence for days. Werner wrote, "Even at the bottom of the sea, the weight of that word was felt." The bells did not ring in Germany. The newspapers spoke of hard fighting on the Volga. The families looked for the names of their sons in the lists published at the end of the page. The letters arrived late and with grease stains. A mother in Hamburg received a note that said, "I'm still alive, though I don't know for how long." It was December. Inside the encirclement, the cold arrived before the hunger. The men slept with their rifles between their legs so that they would not freeze. The horses were slaughtered and boiled with snow. The meat tasted of gunpowder. A sergeant of artillery said that he cut the soles of his boots and boiled them with water to deceive his stomach. At night, the wind sounded like a train that never arrived. The Soviets bombarded without rest. The positions changed every hour. The officers used old maps and corrected them with pencils. The soldiers wrote the names of the dead on pieces of cardboard and left them inside the helmets. In the trenches, the sick raved with voices from their homes. A doctor of the 305th Regiment wrote, "There is nothing left to amputate. We only wait." Goebbels prepared speeches. He spoke of heroism, of sacrifice, of history. In the streets, the people listened in silence. No one applauded. The Allied bombings were already felt in the north. The sirens sounded every night. In the shelters, the women covered the children's ears. Some asked if father was in Stalingrad. No one answered. In January, ice covered the remains of the city. The men walked over frozen bodies. The bullets bounced on the hard ground. The survivors no longer had expression. An officer of the Sixth Army wrote, "We are a dead army that still moves." The German planes dropped packages that fell in the Russian lines. Many died trying to reach them. When the order of surrender arrived, no one heard it. The radios were mute. In some sectors, the combats continued without knowing that everything had ended. Paulus was captured in a cellar with a dirty uniform and an empty gaze. He said only, "The men have done what they could." In Germany, the news arrived on the 3rd of February of 1943. The black flags covered the buildings. In the houses, the portraits were turned around. The returning trains did not bring soldiers, but ashes. In the stations, the women waited all the same. The children counted the wagons. Some bore the number 6 written in chalk. The U-boats in the Atlantic received the radio message with a single word: silence. Werner wrote, "It was as if the sea went out." In the bases, the sailors understood that the war had changed direction. In the workshops, the workers worked without speaking. In the shelters, the civilians began to understand that the noise of the sky was no longer promise, but warning. The few who came out of the encirclement were shadows. Sager saw them pass in Poltava, thin, with their skin stuck to the uniform. One said to him, "There is nothing left there." He was not referring to the city. The eternal retreat. The front was retreating, but no one wanted to say it. On the high command maps, the lines moved westward slowly, as if the paper resisted accepting the truth. On the roads, the soldiers walked through mud and smoke. Sager wrote that the ground trembled with the passage of enemy tanks, that the orders arrived late or not at all. The men burned the papers with the names of their dead comrades because there were no pencils or hope left. The winter of 1943 found them digging trenches in frozen earth. The boots tore apart, the fingers turned black. The horses died first. The men used the blankets of the beasts to cover themselves from the wind. Koshorek said that the mud mixed with blood and that the sound of Russian treads never stopped, not even at night. Each dawn brought a new attack, each attack one less piece of a unit. On the hills of the Dnieper, the bodies piled up without distinction of uniform. The retreat convoys dragged artillery pieces and wounded men. The trucks were full of soldiers who slept sitting. In the villages, the civilians watched them pass without words. Some soldiers asked for bread or water and received empty stares. The Russian population moved like a shadow that no longer hated or feared, only wanted to survive. On the roads remained helmets, photographs, open letters. The officers said that the front was not lost, only withdrawn. No one answered. The Luftwaffe pilots flew over a landscape they no longer recognized. The roads full of German columns looked like open veins. The fields burned. On the airfields, the mechanics used parts from 3 planes to keep one flying. A commander wrote, "We take off with more faith than fuel." In the air, the Allied fighters were more and more. The sky, which had once been a promise of victory, had become a trap. Germany and its cities filled with smoke without battles. The bombings fell every night. Hamburg burned for 7 days. The shelters were full of families and soldiers on leave. The sirens were the sound of the entire country. A woman wrote in her diary, "We no longer tell the days by date, but by attacks." The churches lost their roofs, the streets collapsed. In Berlin, the subway stations served as morgues. Goebbels spoke of resistance and destiny. The women swept the rubble in silence. At sea, the submarines had become moving tombs. Werner wrote that the sound of the Allied sonar was like a countdown. The depth charges fell so close that the men bled from their ears. In the corridors of the U-boat, the air was thick, the water dripped from the valves, and the metal creaked as if about to break. Each dive was a bet. The captains no longer spoke of sinkings, but of surviving one more day. In the ports of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, the concrete roofs were full of cracks. In the bars, no one toasted. The army kept retreating toward the Dniester, toward Poland, toward nothing. Sager wrote that the men no longer knew what they were defending. Fear had replaced ideology. The youngest cried without shame. The veterans said nothing. The field commissars collected the medals that lay scattered. In a letter, a soldier wrote, "The homeland is behind us, but it is also dead." The news from home arrived late. In Berlin, families received telegrams with fewer words each time. "Your son has fallen for Germany." They did not say when or where. The letters from the front spoke of cold, of hunger, and of a sky without birds. In the factories, the women worked 12-hour shifts. The trains evacuated the children to the south. Some returned weeks later, without destination, without name. In the east, the ground turned to mud again. The men dragged the machine guns through puddles that seemed to swallow them. The trucks were stuck up to the axles. The Russians advanced without pause. Verton wrote that the skies filled with artillery and that the enemy tanks drove over the dead without stopping. The survivors moved on foot, guided by the smoke. No one spoke of victories. They only spoke of the next village where perhaps there would be water. At sea, the Kriegsmarine lost its voice. The orders arrived late, the communications were cut off. At the bases, the commanders knew there would be no replacements. The submarines that went out to the Atlantic did so knowing they would not return. Werner wrote, "The ocean had become a cemetery without crosses." The crews no longer wore complete uniforms. They wore civilian clothes, long beards, and empty eyes. Some sank without receiving enemy fire from failure or exhaustion. In Germany, propaganda insisted on the phrase "final victory," but the streets were full of the mutilated, of orphans, and of smoke. The trains carried refugees from the east, the elderly, children, soldiers without weapons. At the stations, the women searched for familiar faces among grey crowds. The improvised hospitals were filled with bodies wrapped in blankets. No one asked from which front they came. Everyone knew there were no fronts left. The retreat became the only possible movement. The soldiers walked without knowing where to go. Sager remembered that the snow covered the roads and that the bodies were buried beneath it, invisible. Some spoke with the dead. Others stopped speaking. In the army diaries, the same phrase was repeated, "Position abandoned." Troops withdrawn. On the northern docks, the sailors watched the horizon without saying a word. The ships were skeletons of steel. The officers who had once believed in the immortality of the Reich watched their hands tremble. On the streets of Berlin, the children played with helmets and pieces of shrapnel. The sky was grey and the flags no longer waved. D-Day. The dawn of the 6th of June of 1944 was thick and grey. In the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, the sentries looked at the horizon without seeing anything. The wind blew from the west and brought a smell of salt and fuel. At 4:30, the sea began to roar. At first it was thought to be a storm. Then the silhouettes appeared. Ships, thousands, as far as the eye could see. A non-commissioned officer of the 726th Regiment said, "It seemed that the sea was walking toward us." In the trenches, the men ran to their posts. The radios did not respond. The cables had been cut the night before by the paratroopers. No one knew whether to fire or wait for orders. In Caen, an officer tried to communicate with Rommel's headquarters, but the field marshal was in Germany attending his wife's birthday. The chain of command broke in minutes. In the bunkers, the gunners adjusted the cannons, looking at a horizon that was no longer sea but a wall of smoke. When the ships opened fire, the earth rose. The sound was not explosion, it was a continuous vibration. On Omaha Beach, the casemates shook with each impact. The men shouted without hearing themselves. A soldier of the 352nd Division would later remember that the air smelled of rust and flesh. The shells passed over their heads like trains. Some tried to leave the shelter to shoot. They did not return. The first landing craft approached like black stains. The gunners fired until the cannons overheated. The machine guns vibrated. The belts jammed. The sights fogged from the moisture. The Allies advanced through fire, but they kept coming. The sea turned red. The Germans said they fired without aiming, only to avoid thinking. In the higher positions, the observers called for air support, but the Luftwaffe did not arrive. The pilots who tried to take off from Le Bourget found the airfields bombed. Only a few managed to fly over the coast. From above, they saw the channel covered with smoke and sparks. A fighter officer wrote, "There is no sky, only fire." In the port of Cherbourg, the sailors of the Kriegsmarine listened to the confused transmissions. Some thought it was a distraction, others understood immediately. The destroyers tried to leave, but the skies were full of Allied fighters. The submarines could not get close. The channel was a minefield. On the docks, the sailors looked at the horizon without orders. One wrote, "We stood watching how the sea swallowed France." On land, the chaos was absolute. The units were mixed. Remnants of coastal divisions fought alongside groups of sappers and cooks. The roads were full of refugees, destroyed carts, and dead horses. The officers tried to regroup the men, but the orders were contradictory. Some received messages to go to Caen, others to Bayeux. The confusion was total. A sub-lieutenant of artillery wrote, "We did not know if we were defending or fleeing. The bombings did not stop all day. The German positions were buried. A soldier said that upon coming out of the dust, he saw the sea full of bodies and smoke. The Allies had taken the beach. The Germans who still resisted did so by instinct. In some sectors, the men surrendered with their ears bleeding from the explosions. In others, they continued shooting until they ran out of ammunition. In the nearby towns, the French civilians hid in the cellars. Some went out at dusk and found the fields full of corpses. They did not distinguish uniforms. In the streets of Caen, the houses burned. The German soldiers asked for water. The children ran in fear. No one knew who was in command. In Germany, the news arrived in the afternoon. Goebbels ordered silence until confirmation was received. When the communiqué was transmitted, it said, "The enemy has initiated a landing operation in the north of France. Our forces fight with heroism." In the houses, the families listened in silence. Some veteran men said, "Then they are already here." In Normandy, the night did not bring calm. The flares lit the field like a sick noon. The paratroopers were still falling, mixed with the bodies of those whose parachutes had not opened. In the towns, the broken bells rang by themselves. The exhausted Germans searched for water, bandages, shelter. A doctor of the 716th Regiment wrote, "I had never seen so many men who did not know whether they were alive." The few tanks that remained tried to counterattack. The roads were blocked by debris and fire. On the edges of the forest of Villers-Bocage, a platoon of panzers destroyed 3 enemy tanks before being surrounded. No one came out. The commander was found inside his vehicle with his hands still on the controls. In the air, the Luftwaffe was still absent. The pilots who managed to take off found no points of reference. The landscape was a mosaic of smoke. Some threw themselves against enemy columns and were shot down. Those who returned said that the channel looked like a floating city. "There was no space for the sea," said one, "only ships." In the following days, the coast filled with prisoners. The Germans were led with their hands up, barefoot, covered in dust. On the roads, the civilians watched them pass without hatred. In Germany, the trains that had once gone east began to go west. In the port of Le Havre, a sailor saw the smoke at dawn and wrote in his notebook, "Today the sea changed owners. The red tide." The summer had begun without news. The men waited in trenches full of mud, listening to the mosquitoes and the creaking of planks swollen by moisture. The maps were torn, the telephone lines silent, the trucks without fuel. It was said that the Russians were preparing something big, but no one could tell a rumor from an order anymore. At dawn, the sky opened with a roar that would not end. First came a flash, then the trembling underfoot, and then nothing, only dust and fire. The shelters collapsed, the bodies disappeared, the fields became a single burning crater. When everything seemed to calm down, it began again. The Soviet artillery did not fire in bursts, but in waves that erased everything. The men shouted orders that no one heard. The positions dissolved in minutes. The wounded dragged the machine guns to the edges of the forest, fired a burst, and fell upon the weapon. Those who could still walk searched for an officer, but the officers were dead or lost in the smoke. The front had become a labyrinth of craters, and inside them were voices asking for water, or praying, or simply repeating their names. The retreat began without warning. The roads were blocked by carts, dead animals, abandoned tanks. Some soldiers walked westward without knowing if they were still in combat. In every village, the doors were open and the smell of burnt bread mixed with that of flesh. Those who fled did not speak. They breathed with open mouths as if the air were also missing. In the ditches lay bodies mixed with civilian luggage. The mothers kept walking with empty arms without looking at anyone. The sky was full of noise. The planes descended, firing at everything that moved. The columns scattered across the fields. A man threw himself to the ground and felt the earth vibrate as if it were alive. When he lifted his head, there was no one left from his platoon, only smoke and the wheels of a truck turning by themselves. The army was dissolving without surrendering. The command posts emptied before the orders arrived. The messages spoke of resistance, but no one knew where. The men walked following the sound of gunfire as if that were a direction. Some found units that no longer existed. Others joined groups of strangers without asking names. The war had lost its shape. The days passed and the landscape was always the same. Mud, fire, bodies, a sweet smell that did not fade even with the rain. The villages were piles of bricks. The horses died standing. The tanks burned with the engines running. In the air remained a thick haze that burned the eyes. Those who still had ammunition saved it for the last moment. The others carried empty rifles, only to not feel their hands bare. In the forests, some tried to organize. A sergeant gathered 20 men and told them they had to reach the Niemen. None knew where it was. They walked 3 days until the Soviets caught them. No one saw them again. Others hid in farms, disguised as peasants. The old men received them without speaking. They gave them bread and watched them eat, as if they were ghosts. The columns of refugees grew. There were women with babies wrapped in blackened blankets, soldiers without boots, starving dogs. Some fell to the sides of the road and did not rise again. The strongest carried the weak in carts. No one asked where they were going. The villages were empty, the wells full of dirty water. The rain fell over everything, making no distinction between the living and the dead. The transmissions kept coming, cut, incoherent. Someone asked for reinforcements. Another asked for permission to withdraw. Another only repeated, "We are surrounded." From the nearest headquarters came replies with promises that no longer existed. The maps became covered with red stains. The radios died one by one. Somewhere on the front, an officer wrote in his notebook, "I no longer know where Germany ends." No one corrected him. No one knew. The sound of engines faded away. The last trucks departed without lights, with almost empty tanks. The men slept sitting with rifles between their legs. On the sides of the road, the smoke hid the dawn. Some thought they saw the sea, but it was only fog. When Minsk fell, no one announced it. The orders kept speaking of reorganization, but there was no one left to receive them. Those who managed to escape said that the enemy advanced as if the ground itself pushed him. The rest stayed in the forests, waiting for the war to pass over them. Those who survived said later that the summer of 1944 smelled of rust, blood, and burnt wheat, and that the wind blew from the east, carrying a dull noise, as if the world were breaking apart from within. Under the ruins of the Reich, the noise never stopped, neither by day nor by night. The sirens, the engines, the roofs falling. The streets were covered in dust, and the air smelled of hot iron. No one slept more than a few hours. When the sound of boots on the rubble was heard, everyone knew that something had changed again. The soldiers passed without speaking, covered in soot, with sunken eyes. Some did not even know from which unit they came. The civilians looked at them with a tired respect, as if they were specters from another war. The sky had become an enemy. The explosions came from above and from everywhere. The windows no longer existed. The walls trembled with each impact. The mothers ran with the children in their arms toward the remaining basements. There the air was thick and the dust stuck to the sweat. Someone prayed in a low voice, another cursed. There were those who stayed silent, looking at the beams, waiting for the next bomb not to be theirs. At the front, the men no longer spoke of victories. The uniform was barely a grey rag stained with mud and dried blood. The divisions were shattered. Some received orders to advance, but there was nowhere to go. The earth itself seemed to move. The Soviet tanks appeared without warning, as if coming out of the smoke. They fired and kept moving. The Germans fired back and then fled on foot. The trenches were full of wounded, asking for water and cigarettes. No one had either. The nights were worse. The red sky could be seen from kilometers away. The towns burned without anyone trying to extinguish them. The roads were full of refugees, old people, women, children, all walking westward without looking back. They carried carts with blankets, chickens, portraits. Some stopped and did not continue. The others kept walking without speaking. A soldier wrote, "The silence of the civilians is more frightening than the tanks." The trains were full of bodies. Some were breathing, others were not. On the platforms, the women offered bread or simply waited with an empty stare. There was a smell of smoke and wet bodies. The hospitals were overflowing. The doctors operated on kitchen tables. The nurses used curtains as bandages. No one asked names. The soldiers died without anyone counting them. In the cities, those who could still work carried bricks and removed rubble to rebuild the walls, knowing they would fall again. The children played among the craters and picked up fragments of shrapnel as if they were toys. Some men dug graves in the parks, others slept on benches. The official speeches spoke of resistance, but the radios already sounded distorted, as if broadcasting from another world. In the ports, the ships set sail without knowing where to go. The sailors saw the horizon covered in smoke. The engines worked halfway. There were orders to evacuate, but no one said whom. In the holds, soldiers and civilians, wounded and children were mixed together. The captains stayed on the bridge looking at the grey water without speaking to anyone. Some ships did not return. In the villages, the war moved like a storm. First the noise, then the soldiers, then the silence. The peasants waited in their houses until the door opened and an unknown voice shouted orders. Sometimes they were Russians, sometimes Germans fleeing. It made no difference. The walls were full of holes and the fields full of mines. The cows mooed tied to the posts, the dogs disappeared. Those who survived did so without understanding why. In the air, the pilots saw the land burn like an open wound. The planes flew low, dropping loads without aiming. The gunners no longer looked through the sights, they fired by instinct. Fuel was scarce. The engines stopped in mid-flight. Some jumped with parachutes and fell over the remains of their own country. Those who returned found the airfields destroyed. The flags had been torn apart by the wind. In the shelters of Berlin, the air was unbreathable. The roofs leaked, the lamps flickered. The men slept dressed, with their rifles leaning against the wall. They ate once a day if anything was left. There were people who no longer went to the surface. They did not know whether it was night or day. The voices on the radio spoke of a final struggle. No one answered. The Soviet tanks were heard before they were seen. First the distant rumble, then the glass falling, and finally the metal scraping the cobblestones. On the corners, the last German soldiers waited behind piles of bricks. Some were teenagers, others old men with rusty decorations. They fired and hid. Sometimes they did not fire. A 15-year-old boy wrote in his notebook, "I am not afraid, but I have nothing to lose." The women locked themselves in the basements with their children, knowing what was coming. Outside, the fighting continued. The facades fell like paper. The trees burned. The corpses piled up at the entrances to the subway. No one moved them. At night, the shadows walked among the bodies looking for something useful, a coat, a spoon, a watch. Those who still had faith spoke in low voices. Those who did not simply waited. The Reich no longer existed, but the war continued. The officers committed suicide in their offices. The civilians burned documents. The churches were empty, and the prayers were lost among the sounds of gunfire. When the silence returned, it was not peace. It was a thick emptiness. The buildings were skeletons. The streets were covered in dust, and the air smelled of ash. The men came out of the shelters without knowing what to do. The children looked for their parents. The soldiers looked for an enemy who was no longer there. No one spoke. Only the wind was heard, dragging papers and soot. The war had ended, but no one knew it yet.